In Chapter 5, we're going to look at the effect of changes in supply and demand on prices and quantities. The supply and demand curve will determine where the price and the quantity is. Here, for this intersection of supply and demand, we have this price and this quantity. But what happens if one of those curves shifts? In this case, we're going to shift the supply curve out from its position at S1 to its position at S2. What we find is that we fall from our equilibrium point, point 1, to our equilibrium point, point 2. Here we're going to shift the supply curve from its position at S1 to a new position at S2. We see that when we shift the supply curve out, we go from equilibrium point 1 to equilibrium point 2. Equilibrium point 2 has a fall in price and an increase in quantity. So by shifting one of the curves, we change the price and quantity location. The key in economics, in our basic analyses, is that we do not shift the supply or the demand equations. In economics, we hold all other factors constant and look at one set of events. So the supply and the demand curves don't change position. We may have a market configuration and then another configuration that we compare against that. For example, here we have a typical market situation with a set supply and demand curve and a market solution. Over here we have the same supply and demand equations, but we have a different result because in this case we don't have a market outcome, we have a monopoly outcome. And the monopolist will equate marginal revenue with supply and then price off demand, as you'll see later in market imperfections and market structure chapters. So what happens here is not that the supply and demand curves are changing, but that it's a different analysis of the same supply and demand equations. So we're only changing one thing to look at it, but we don't change the basic parameters of supply and demand. That's how we can tell the effect of the change in market structure on the underlying market. If the supply and demand curves are changing at the same time we change the analysis of the market structure, we can't tell what the effect is from the market structure change versus the change in supply and demand. So just as in physics or chemistry where only one variable is changed at a time, the same thing holds true in economics. The supply and demand equations stay constant in the analysis, and then we change the market structure of the market. So in Chapter 5, we look at the effects of supply and demand curve changes so that you have an understanding and facility with supply and demand equations. However, in our analyses, we will not be moving the supply and demand curves around.